Film director Toby Watts.
There is a great place for horror films. They keep God on the agenda. The idea that there could be something outside of what we see in front of us. If people didn't think these were real, would they be that frightened of them? And I wonder if it's because people are lacking such an amount of spiritual depth in their lives. Horror films can come in and actually give people an experience of something beyond themselves and hopefully leave people thinking, I'm glad I don't live in that world, but if I was in that world, what would I do? What would I call upon?
There are plenty of horror films that I wouldn't want to go near, but I think there are things that horror can say, potentially, that no other genre can. On the cross, you are seeing Jesus take all the horror, all the sin on himself. At the centre of our faith is an utterly horrific image, and yet it is also the most glorious.
Let's get right into the heart of this conversation. Should Christians watch horror films?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, maybe...
Media consumption is optional. Hello, Reformed mythologist Morgan Locke here with a video about horror films. Now, I don't know the first thing about horror films, but I'm joined by two men who know at least a little bit. One of them is film director Toby Watts. Toby, hello.
Hi there.
And the other is, for full disclosure, Thomas Thorogood of this parish, who has worked on the Reformed Mythologist channel before, but who is, in his own right, a horror film critic and YouTuber extraordinaire. So I'm really excited to get into this conversation about horror films and what we can do with them. How, as Christians, we ought to think about horror, whether this is a genre which is worth our attention, bearing in mind that media consumption is optional and that you are under no obligation to watch any horror movies. Thomas, I'll start off with you. What is a horror film?
Oh, great question. Well, I tend to answer that by saying I think it's any film that consistently creates an atmosphere of dread. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Toby. There's often a bit of a blurring of the boundary between horror and thriller. We know what tension is, and that's something a thriller film can do. Something like a Jason Bourne film has a lot of tension. You're watching it, and it's really tense and suspenseful. But horror, I think it's this kind of suspense that something horrific is going to happen, and it sustains that for the course of the film. Because horror is a bit of a tricky subject and is maybe a bit of a dirty word sometimes to some people, people are often reluctant to use it as a label. So I remember talking to someone who saw A Quiet Place and they said it was really good, and I was like, oh wow, I heard that was a horror film, and he was like, oh, I wouldn't call it a horror film, I'd call it more a thriller. Now it totally kind of is a horror film. It may not be the scariest horror film, but it's very much working in that space. Something like Jaws or Alien as well. So it's quite broad. It's not just supernatural horror, which is what I think people tend to go to, or torture or anything like that. Anything really psychological, creature feature that consistently creates that kind of atmosphere of dread. But I don't know what you guys think about that definition I've just kind of come
beautiful.
Up with there.
Toby, what do you think? Consistently creates an atmosphere of dread. That's a pretty sharp definition. Toby, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a really good definition. I'm glad you went for an emotion as a way of describing what the genre is, because some people might be tempted to say, talk about plot or the story in some way and delineate it that way. But I do absolutely agree that horror films primarily are trying to elicit dread. I would also, add in words like horror and terror, extreme levels of fear and anxiety and so on. Anything that's kind of to the extreme on that end, I would say that's what horror films are trying to do, and if a film's trying to do that, then I think it's fair to call it a horror. I think also, there are tropes within horror that can help us to identify what is a horror film. There's often a debate around Silence of the Lambs, is that a thriller or is it a horror film? Because thrillers often have this sort of investigative criminal aspect to it, where a crime has been committed and someone's trying to uncover what's going on. Horrors don't necessarily have that. They can be a lot more irrational. There doesn't need to be as much of an investigation. It's more of an escape. Yeah, the debate will always rage on. That what's the fine line between thriller and horror? There is a lot of blurring, but I think if we stick with it's really trying to bring out these emotions in people that we've discussed, then I'm happy. That's what a horror film is.
So horror and thriller. Is Thriller by Michael Jackson, is the music video for Thriller actually a horror rather than a thriller? That's a deep question.
That's a very profound question.
It is. I'm going to think about that for some time now. Toby, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience, personal experience with sort of making horror films, and how you sort of got into it, and why you've chosen that genre, I suppose, as your thing.
It's an interesting route in, actually, because when I kind of accidentally came into horror in some ways. I've always enjoyed horror films. I went through probably a period where I didn't watch any, and I was really reluctant to go there. But something changed at some point, and I got really back into them. And as I was developing my filmmaking career, me and my brother, who I work with, we were working on our first idea for a film. Really, it was a supernatural thriller with, elements of horror, you might say. But what happened was, so we made the film, and we were careful not to make it too much of a horror, because just that wasn't what the story, was really about. But what happened is, when it was being packaged up by our sales agent, and we were in talks with distributors, and they were talking about posters and trailers, they were saying, oh no, it's a horror, we need to make it a horror, that's where the audience is, and that's how people will recognise this. And we thought, oh wow, actually there's this whole other end of the filmmaking chain, really, where it's so much about the audience and their expectations, that we realised there's a huge audience for horror in a way there isn't for thriller. People kind of gravitate towards horror and what that does. And I think somehow we started to realise, okay, this is a great way in for us. Just from a purely pragmatic point of view, you can make horror films very low budget without famous cast and expensive set pieces. The audiences are almost like that low budget aesthetic. So it's a great way into horror films when you're not established. Yeah, but also there's just such a big audience for it. So we kind of tumbled into it after making that first film and it being labelled and pushed out as a horror film. We realised maybe this is the way we want to go.
And that is interesting that people, fans, the audience, define themselves as horror movie fans. And that's a label that they can wear and be sort of proud of.
Yeah, I think with horror, it's an incredibly imaginative and broad genre. And because of that, you get a lot of incredible inventiveness around characters and fantasy worlds in a way I think you don't get with thriller. And therefore, there's a lot more of a commercial element to horror. People can buy into it, and I follow people on social media whose whole rooms are decked out with all the different merchandise from all the horror films, the posters and bed sheets and life-size dolls, and it's this whole fun cosplay thing to it. Whereas you just don't get that with many other genres, other than perhaps Marvel and that kind of thing. Horror just opens up a whole identity for people.
Thomas, let me come back to you as a what I'm going to call a horror expert. So we talked about, obviously, horror films. That's it's a visual medium. It's visual storytelling. Maybe these aesthetics lend themselves to visual depiction and portrayal. But obviously, there were horror stories and ghost stories and all that sort of stuff way before they ever made it onto the screen. Where do you think that comes from as a genre outside of film, particularly?
Well, Nate, I'm going to do what you guys from Speak Live from Reformed Mythologists have taught me. I'm going to go right back to Genesis. And I think there we kind of see the origin of horror, really, because every horror film, every horror story has one place that's off limits, one book that should not be opened, one word that should not be said, one room that you should not go into. And it's almost become a bit of a cliche because we're kind of screaming at the characters on screen, don't open that door, it's going to be bad. But they always do it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the experience you get when reading Genesis 3, that it's clearly marked, this tree. God has told Adam and Eve not to eat from it. But what do? They go there. And actually, that's something so fundamental about human nature. What are we like? We have a tendency to press the self-destruct button. And so I think you see there the origin of fear and shame, and actually flowing out from that, Cain and Abel is kind of the first slasher story.
Okay.
It even, Cain has even described his face as downcast, so he's this kind of masked killer who's wandering around. So I suppose in terms of where does this idea of fear come from? I think we'd have to go right back to the beginning. But it seems, as you look around folklore and stories from around the world and down through history, whether they would have called them horror stories or whether they just contain elements that we, looking at them now, would consider to be horrific is a different question. But this idea of grappling with dark forces and recognizing that there are dark forces in the world. Lots of cultures talk about dragons, for instance, and view those as a pretty terrifying thing. We all die. So we've all, as humans, have been forced to contend with the fact that there is darkness in the world. And so I think it's very natural that our storytelling, if it's reflecting something of reality, it would be disingenuous in a sense if it didn't grapple with some of those themes. Yeah.
There was a quotation from a horror film director called Scott Derrickson. I've no idea who that is. Either of you know that name?
He's done some big movies like Sinister, more recently The Black Phone with Ethan Hawke, but also Doctor Strange. So a big Hollywood director who works in horror.
Okay, so Scott Derrickson, he is apparently a professing Christian, so he said this: "To me, the horror genre is the genre of non-denial. It's about admitting that there is evil in the world and recognizing that there is evil within us and that we're not in control, and that the things we are afraid of must be confronted in order for us to relinquish that fear. I think the horror genre serves a great purpose in bolstering our understanding of what is evil and therefore better defining what is good." So weirdly, is he sort of saying, unless you have horror as a category and as a genre, you actually will misread the world? If it's the genre of non-denial, then without horror, you are living in denial. Is that fair in a way? I just want to make the point as kind of the argument for horror films, I suppose, as strongly as possible before we kind of try to kind of take it down.
Yeah, I think he's spot on, and I know he also said something around, we don't need a lot more horror in the world, but we do need a lot more reckoning with horror and evil. And I think what he's getting at is, that horror films enable us to do that in a safe way. Because at the end of the day, stories are not just about life as we want to see it. It's about life as it is, and helping us to have metaphors to process that and get our heads around what's going on. So I think he's absolutely right about non-denial, that horror films are showing life in all its kind of raw nature, and helping people also. When you think about trying to create emotional experiences that help people to experience the light and the good in the world, that actually it feels a lot more intense when you've been in a very dark place. And I think that Jesus kind of understands that as well. When he talks about those who have been forgiven much love much. There is a sense that those who've been to the darkest places in themselves and in the world know more of God's grace and God's light. And if we just sit in our little Christian bubbles over here, just consuming so-called Christian media and avoiding the darkness, then there is a risk that actually we're not being honest about how big God's glory is, how big his love and his grace is, and we're going to miss out on that as well. Okay, so thought a bit more sort of horror in the abstract in terms of, trying to categorize it, relate it to other genres, look at some of its features and, potentially the theological underpinnings of it or the arguments that could be made in favor of it. Let's get into some specifics. What's your favourite horror film? Thomas, you go for it.
Oh, man. Yeah, I think a film that really opened my eyes to what it can do was Us, the Jordan Peele film that came out in 2019. I mean, it's just incredible. Jordan Peele obviously comes from a comedy background. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, Nate, because you're quite into comedy. Why it is that he was able to segue, it seems, so naturally into directing horror. And I wonder if it's something to do with the fact that both horror and comedy have quite visceral impacts on the audience. But I remember seeing that, and it's just got so much going on about the idea of doppelgangers. It's called Us, which is also like, is it US? Is it about America? And it has a Bible verse, Jeremiah 11:11, that keeps coming up, which is about kind of the judgment of God. So it's bringing together all these themes, and it's actually quite genre defying. Get Out, his previous film, I think was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Comedy. but it was kind of a horror. And I think that indicates how his films are actually kind of hard to put in boxes because they're combining all these elements. But that was, Us was a film that I remember really getting under my skin.
Okay.
What about you, Toby?
For me, it would definitely be Candyman. I absolutely love that film. I think it's, if there is a near perfect horror film, that one for me is great. It's got wonderfully haunting music throughout, a brilliant score by Philip Glass. And in horror films, the score carries so much of the emotion. It's brilliant. But also, I think the mythology around Candyman, it brilliantly deals with race and deprivation in America, but in the most unself-conscious way. And I think that's where the new Candyman film fell down. It was incredibly self-conscious around issues of the day, and I just felt it just got in the way of a good story. Whereas the original Candyman, he's this urban legend figure that appears and stalks people once they give themselves over and repeat his name in the mirror. But he's also an incredibly romantic villain. The way that he kind of seduces his victims and plays with them, as well as him being incredibly vicious and committing gory crimes, there is a sense of he's like a lover as well to the protagonist as well. And I think that's endlessly fascinating, that you're drawn in to feel some kind of empathy for him because he's been created out of terrible trauma in his past many years previously. And so you do kind of get on his side and start to understand his plight, and yet you're repulsed by what he's doing. And I think because of those textures around the evil villain, when you do that in a film, I think it causes the audience to just have a bit of a deeper experience, as well as all the surface level shock and horror.
So there we go. I'm not going to let you mention any other horror films, just those two. So Us and Candyman, literally the only two horror films. Now, give us some more as well, Thomas. Something else maybe that's you're itching to talk about. If you were trying to convince someone that horror films, it's a legitimate genre, and this is not just good filmmaking, but it's also, it's a good thing to engage with this idea, not just entertaining, but it's a good idea. What would you say? I'm
a big fan of Wes Craven. He's often considered one of the best horror film directors. He came from quite a strict Baptist upbringing, which he seemed to reject later in life. But it's interesting to see how he held on to certain tenets that he almost certainly received from his faith, or certainly from the Christian culture around him. So he said, I don't like horror films that end with general massacres, a survivor crawling out at the end and the bad guy jumping on him for the very last scare. I read so many horror scripts that have that kind of bleak ending. They say villains will win out and the most brutally powerful survive. In my work, I'm continually fighting that. And that's really interesting when you put that together with probably one of his most well-known films, Nightmare on Elm Street. It's an incredibly powerful film about this killer who stalks people in dreams. I mean, this is a slight spoiler, so cover your ears if you don't want to, if you want to go into the film knowing nothing. But Wes Craven wanted the film to end with deliverance. He wanted for the monster to be defeated and for good to kind of triumph. And what's revealing is the studio, New Line Studio, who were basically allowing him to make this film, they wanted it to end with a hint that the bad guy was still around so that they could set up a sequel, basically. So I find that absolutely fascinating, that Wes Craven wanted good to win and to let his characters kind of have the happy ending, whereas the studio wanted to keep them kind of locked in conflict with the horror. And in the end, the result was sort of a compromise, because he realised the only way he could get the film made was through this studio. For me, actually, some of the gold of the horror genre is when, when the good guys get out, when the monster is defeated, when it captures something of that idea of deliverance, of light shining in the darkness. And I think you see an element of that in Nightmare on Elm Street.
Toby, do you have any others? I mean, obviously Candyman was, it's quite a big one, as you say, might be the perfect horror film, but any others that have had a big impact on you, not just as someone who wanted to watch more of them, but also end up making them? I
think there's a film called Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, which was made after the series in the 1990s, late 80s, Twin Peaks, but it was telling the story that precedes the TV series. That's by David Lynch, one of my favourite film directors of all time. And that's an interesting film, because some might say, oh, it's not a horror film. But I think in many ways it is really, it explores the horror around incest, around demon possession, around the nightmare of the kind of suburban American family appearing all nice on the surface and the lovely kind of prom queen girl, but actually underneath that is drugs and serious domestic harm going on. But I think David Lynch is a real master of capturing the textures of lightness and darkness, even within the same scene, within the same moment. And I think for me, that a film like that has really shaped some of my approach to filmmaking, in that if I can even get 10% of the way towards playing that range of notes on the filmmaking piano, if you like, that David Lynch gets, then I'm doing well.
You can make films with a piano? That sounds incredible. You probably can now, can't you, with these computers these days?
AI
piano, yeah.
Back to that idea of the visual storytelling, so that there are certain props, masks, weapons, sort of, etc., costumes, which are instantly recognizable as a particular film character, and that the history of film is, the horror has played a huge part in that. And I suppose particularly in the 80s and 90s, where you've got some incredibly strong visual images being kind of created. You mentioned Nightmare on Elm Street. Think of the Halloween franchise, and was it Jason? Is he the guy in Halloween with the mask? Is that right?
Michael Myers. Sorry, the name had gone for a second. Halloween's Michael Myers, isn't it?
So who's Jason then? Have I just made him up?
He's Friday the 13th.
He's Friday. Oh, is that Freddy? Who's Freddy Krueger then? Nightmare on Elm Street.
That's Nightmare on Elm Street.
Oh,
yeah,
my goodness.
And then Ghostface is Scream.
They've all merged in.
Yeah,
I've got basically a horror film multiverse that's going on.
I was going to say, there's something there.
There's a major crossover event that's happened in my head, at least, with putting all these films together. Toby, let me just ask you a little bit about Playhouse. Was that your first feature?
Yeah, that was our first feature film. I'd made a number of short films and lots of music videos, corporate videos, promos, documentaries, things like that. But really the goal was always to make a feature film, and Playhouse was the culmination of the years into that first one.
Wow. And yeah, I mean, just such a lot that's involved in, making a feature film. I mean, it's not just making a short film, but longer, is it? How did you sort of tackle that in terms of, obviously you said you made this and produced it with your brother, but yeah, how did you first get the idea for what you wanted to do with that story?
With low budget filmmaking or micro budget filmmaking or zero budget filmmaking, whatever label you want to give it, when you're trying to make your first film and you're thinking it needs to be under 100,000 and preferably a lot lower than that, you're almost reverse engineering the idea from what do you have available, what's at your disposal. And we had this amazing location, Freswick Castle in the north of Scotland. We knew that we wanted to film there. That wasn't going to be a problem. We weren't going to have to pay for that. Well, we grew up there because actually it's technically our family home. Our dad bought it in the 90s and has been renovating it ever since. And so we knew everything about the castle and the location, the beaches, the sheds, and everything that was around. Even features on the wall or in the floorboards, we could remember that there's a hole there. And a lot of these things work their way into the story. And that's partly because it's fun to create out of constraints like that. Because when you're facing the blank page, you've so many choices to make. Why not actually just go with a few more limited options and be creative with it? But we knew it would add immense production value. And often what's missing or hard to get in a low budget film is great production value. So with the light being so amazing and with the setting being so amazing up there, we knew that we'd be off to a good start. But it took us a few years to arrive at the idea we had, because we went through various cycles of drama, comedy, and all sorts of ideas. But the one ingredient that lingered through our development process over years was this relationship between a father and a daughter who are a bit at odds. And eventually we landed on something that we thought suited the tone and the atmosphere of the area in winter, which was this kind of supernatural thriller horror film.
Let's get right into the heart of this conversation. Enough beating around the bush and messing about. Should Christians watch horror films?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, maybe I'm biased. they should watch it, otherwise they go out of business. But no, I think it's an interesting. Should Christians watch horror? I like to think of horror films on the surface level, a bit like going for a curry. In that, when you go for a curry, you've always got two kinds of people. There's always a person who loves a chicken korma. It's very mild and coconutty, no spice, and that's a great night out for them. And anything more than that would be a bad idea. But then you've got a person who would love the chicken vindaloo or the madras, and having a korma is a nightmare. So for them, a good night out is to have something really spicy. Both valid experiences you can have at the curry house. In some ways, I think horror is like that, in that some people, they only respond to more visceral mediums. They respond to the imagery, the sound, the intensity of that. That's how stories work for them. That's how they see their own reality. And therefore they want to see that reflected back at them in a more intense way. Similarly, people like roller coasters. Some people hate them, but who are we to say that one's right or wrong? So I think on the surface, there's just recognising the variety of different types of people and what speaks to people. I think some Christians are not contented just watching, so-called Christian media, or essentially avoiding much of what's out there in culture for fear that it's going to contaminate them and so on. Should Christians watch horror? I think I would encourage people, if they have the capacity to have a chicken vindaloo or a madras, I think they should try it actually. They should watch a horror film, because they might actually learn something that they wouldn't find in another genre. They might actually encounter something of the numinous, which is an idea I'm really interested in. The link between the experience of watching a horror film and the kind of repulsion and fear and disgust on one hand you have, as well as the attraction and the allure and the compelling nature of it, is much like the experience that we see people have in the Word, with God, that they're frightened on one level, but also drawn to Him. And I wonder if sometimes in horror films what's really happening is people are coming into contact with something well beyond themselves, outside of the materialistic realm, and they are drawn to that, and they can't necessarily put their finger on it, and they want more and more of it. And I wonder if some Christians would actually benefit from stretching themselves and their emotional range of life by making themselves vulnerable to a horror film.
Mm-hmm. So the sequel to Playhouse is going to be called Curry House.
Curry House.
Thomas, let me put the same question to you in terms of should Christians watch horror films. I think there are many Christians who will be familiar with their Bibles and will be aware of passages which talk about, whatsoever is lovely and whatsoever is admirable and praiseworthy. Think about those things. So why would Christians spend their time looking at things which aren't those things, which are in fact distortions of the good, or which are horrible?
Yeah, great question. And it is a controversial area, isn't it? And I guess I wouldn't expect full agreement on it at all. And I think it's something that people probably work out on a personal basis. There are some things that I'd be uncomfortable to watch, but I know other Christians have watched those. There are some of the things that I am comfortable watching that lots of Christians would say, no, I don't want to go near that. And in a sense, I'd maybe be a little bit more cautious than Toby, or just add the caveat that there are plenty of horror films that I wouldn't want to go near, especially when it tips more into the exploitation side of things, where it seems to be not just depicting violence but kind of glorifying it, or it feels like the film's kind of enjoying that. When it has more of a sadistic quality, that makes me uncomfortable. So I suppose I wouldn't frame it of should Christians watch horror. In a sense, it's not for everyone. It's quite a niche genre, and I probably wouldn't. My goal with my YouTube channel isn't kind of to make more horror fans, but I suppose, is the genre saying something of value? And I completely agree with Toby that I think there are things that horror can say potentially that no other genre can. And it's interesting that Philippians verse you quoted, Nate, whatever is good, whatever is true. Also included in that is whatever is true. And if we're honest, in considering the full truth of what this world is like, which the Bible is, read the book of Judges, and I would say there's a lot of horror in that, in the book of Revelation as well, because we are living in a world where there is a diabolical enemy. My goal isn't necessarily to make more people watch horror or encourage more people to watch horror, but I think we do need to have a wider conversation about there is horror in this world, and I think we need to kind of reckon with that in some way. The thing that getting into horror films has helped me with the most is just consider the radical nature of the most horrific event in history is the crucifixion, isn't it? That on the cross you are seeing Jesus take all the horror, all the sin on himself, and that he doesn't go there in spite of his divinity, but that is where his glory is being revealed. That in the deepest darkness, keep going, because he bursts out into resurrection life on the other side. So there's something deeply profound about that at the center of our faith is an utterly horrific image, and yet it is also the most glorious thing. And that shows us something about what God does with horror. I don't know, sorry, very garbled thoughts there, but I guess I'm cautious to a degree, and I'm conscious that for some people it would be unwise to watch certainly some of these films. Just as, Breaking Bad, I think, is one of the best TV series of all time, but I completely understand if someone who struggles with addiction doesn't want to watch it, even though the show doesn't glorify drug use. I mean, you come away from it with the opposite message, but some people, because of their dispositions, might find that an unhelpful thing to watch. You're always saying that media consumption is optional, and I think we need to be discerning about everything we watch. And it's actually the genres like romantic comedy that I'm kind of more suspicious of sometimes, because they might present, having an affair as a completely fine thing to do. And that's almost more insidious in a way, because the film dresses it up as a very fluffy thing, but it's actually an awful message. Whereas horror, I think our guard is up a bit more. And the morality of a lot of horror films is actually clear cut. It's kind of like, yeah, there's evil, and it needs to be defeated. And there's something quite refreshing about that, actually, the lack of moral ambiguity, when so many Disney villains now are people who are misunderstood or something like that. For a horror film to say, no, there is something called evil with a capital E. So yeah, caution, but I think there's something of value in this genre. Yeah.
Do you have any other thoughts on that, Toby?
Yeah, I think that, there is a great place for horror films because they keep God on the agenda. They keep the idea that there could be something outside of what we see in front of us, that could be real. And I think it's interesting that in our increasingly secular or disinterested age that we have, there's such a fan base and an interest in horror, and that never seems to go away, really. The trends change, and what people are interested in particular changes, but people are always interested to see supernatural horror, ghosts, all of these things on the screen. And I think that's interesting. Like, what is it people are actually seeking? If people didn't think these were real, would they be that frightened of them? Why do they want to go and kind of tempt fate and to be scared by something? And I wonder if it's because people are lacking such an amount of spiritual depth in their lives. Horror films can come in and actually give people an experience of something supernatural, something beyond themselves, and hopefully leave people, when they go out of the cinema or turn off the telly, thinking, I'm glad I don't live in that world, but if I was in that world, what would I do? How would I get out of that situation? What would I call upon to deal with that? So I feel there's an inherently, and as Thomas said, that there's an inherently spiritual element to them, but also a moral. They're very moral films because the framework and the rules of the game are established so well that it's a great playground for Christian storytellers, but also a great medium to be communicating in culture as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, just one thing on that. I saw Hereditary with a friend who's probably like the staunchest atheist I know. And afterwards he just turned to me and he said, oh yeah, I'd never do a Ouija board or seance or anything like that. And I was like, oh, interesting. Because we both had that experience of watching this quite scary film together about showing the pretty terrible consequences of dabbling with the demonic. Because neither of us could deny the kind of reality of the fear that we were feeling during that film, that was a great springboard for a conversation about spiritual things. So yeah, back to the Scott Derrickson thing about the genre of non-denial. These films go there, and they may not necessarily express it in ways that accord with Christian understandings of the demonic and life after death, but it is one of the few genres that's actually raising these sorts of questions about the nature of evil and mortality and those kinds of things. So yeah, some interesting evangelistic conversations can come out of watching a horror film with your friends, potentially.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. I think when you're trying to engage with people, it's great if you can ask a good question that opens up a really good conversation. And I'm not sure you could have a better start to a conversation than saying, do you like horror films? Because if someone, it doesn't matter what someone says, they can say, oh no, but there's usually a reason. And it might be something like, I was, having a sleepover at my friend's house and they put on, this horror film and it really terrified me. And I've actually, I've really had to stay away from that stuff ever since. You can then go into that a little bit by sort of saying, but, what have you found that's comforted you? There was a thing that was terrifying and scary. What is it that was providing comfort and helping you get over it? Because it's confronting. It's giving you something which is difficult. Or they might share stories of, yes, I've really enjoyed them. I love this and I love that. Okay, so again, what is it about that story and that mythos that engages you? And how do you think that relates to the world we actually live in? How does the what if of the film relate to the what is of your ordinary life? And that all storytelling gives us an opportunity to do that. But as you both mentioned, the spectral realm is being often displayed to us. I mean, obviously, there's loads of horror films that don't have a kind of supernatural dimension to them, but so often they do open up conversation about the spiritual, which provides an opportunity for a conversation about the Holy Spirit and, God himself, who has taken on flesh in order to deal with evil and to kind of join us. That if someone's feeling anxious, I think, about, I don't want to read stuff that's got demons in it. Well, I'm sorry, all the Gospels are now unavailable to you as reading material. The great news is Christus Victor. Christ has won the victory over that, and that is the actual world we live in. The world we currently live in which this conversation is happening, in which people are watching this YouTube video, is the world in which Christ, as the eternal God, has dealt Satan a fatal blow, and that we do not need to fear evil. So I think, there are opportunities for conversations, but I do like that kind of the curry house analogy. But people have got different dispositions. People have got different experiences, and they're going to be able to cope with different things. And as I always say, you're under no obligation to watch these kinds of stories. You don't have to. It's not that you should. There's an ought. It's an obligation. It might be a possibility for you, if that's the sort of thing that you're going to find helpful in your Christian life. But yeah, thank you for a great conversation, guys. Thomas, where can people find you and your work in the horror film genre?
Yeah. If you just go to YouTube and type in Thomas Thorogood, my name with a T, then you can find the video essays I do, mostly kind of around horror and sci-fi things, and I've done a few short films on there as well, but nothing at the level of our friend Toby here. So yeah.
Well, yes, and then when you're typing in Thomas Thorogood, it will present you with Thomas the Tank Engine. So just avoid all of that and go straight for Thorogood. And as I say, some of the best video essays I think I've ever seen in terms of engaging with film and television.
Oh, bless you. Well, that means a lot coming from you, Nate. You're the reform mythologist himself. So
well, there we go. Toby, how can people keep up to date with the stuff you're doing? What's coming up from you?
Yeah, so actually We've got a new feature film coming out next week, I think.
Oh, wow.
Which is very exciting. It's going to hit Amazon Prime soon, and I don't know when. They're not telling us at the moment. But there's a new platform called Found TV, which is all about found footage. And that launched this month. And so look out for my new film called Black Daruma, which is coming onto that platform on the 16th of October, which by the time this goes out may be past.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation. And yes, we'll look forward to chatting again soon. Do check out those links. There's some really great content there. But do remember, media consumption is optional. You are under no obligation to watch any horror slasher, thriller films. I've been Reformed Mythologist Nate Morgan Locke. I'm glad you were here.